Welcome, everyone. My name is Faulkner, and I'm the Online Event Coordinator for Staff Development for Educators. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today for Questioning in the Mathematical Practice Standards, Grades 3 through 5 with Ricky Mikelman. Before we start, there are a few things you should know. So that Ricky can be heard clearly, we do place our attendees on mute. Please use the questions text box on your screen throughout the webinar to ask any questions. We'll use those for our Q&A period at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, and assuming no technical difficulties, you'll receive a link to the archive in 48 hours, as well as a link to a printable certificate of participation. Finally, at the end of today's presentation, you will be asked to complete a short survey, and please do that for us. Your input does assist us in providing future complimentary webinars. Now, a little bit about SDE. At SDE, we believe educators have the most important job in the world, and it's our mission to empower pre-K through 12 educators across the country with sustained professional development solutions that are not only research-based and rigorous, but also practical, innovative, and fun. Our goal is to help you create environments that prepare your students for the evolving demands of the 21st century. We believe together we can create extraordinary classrooms. We're pleased to have Ricky Mikelman joining us for today's webinar. Ricky has spent 25 years in education as a classroom teacher at every level from kindergarten to 5th grade and as a math coach in California and Texas. She's been active in curriculum writing and district-wide staff development, but teaching is her passion. In 2005, she was awarded the Los Angeles County Excellence in Promoting Math Instruction Award. She discovered Singapore math while looking for methods to help her struggling students and has become an enthusiastic supporter of Singapore math for all students. Her passion for teaching shines through in her energetic and humorous presentations. Welcome, Ricky. At this point, I'm going to turn it all over to you.
Hi, welcome everybody. I hope this year is off to a wonderful start for all of you. And I have to tell you, I just got back from vacation and I was going to replace that picture with one of my vacation photos, but I couldn't find one I liked. So we're going to go ahead and start. Today we're going to be talking about questioning and the math practices. And if you're in a Common Core state, what I'm really talking about here is how the practices fit in, how questioning fits in with the 8 mathematical practices. These are the standards of mathematical practice that we're hearing so much about. If you are in a state that has opted out of the math practices, this really fits in also because it matches the NCTM standards. Math has changed greatly within the last few years. We're seeing a huge paradigm shift that we used to want to teach our children procedures. They needed to know the 4 operations. They needed to understand fractions. But the reality is now we don't need our children to be calculators. If you have been lucky enough to see Dr. Yap Bon Har, he will tell you calculators are fast. We don't need our children to be fast. If you want a calculator, everybody's carrying around a smartphone now. We need our children to be thinkers. And as I discovered as I was getting more and more into working with children on these rich mathematical tasks, that our children were struggling with how to, I was struggling on how to get some really rich, deep thinking, and I needed better questioning skills. And then as I looked at these 8 standards, I discovered that I was really good in some areas and not good at others. So I decided to come up with question stems that I could have at hand that would help me in ways that could get the kids thinking. Now, if you want good questioning, you have to have a product to question. So you need to present kids with an interesting problem. This could be a rich mathematical task. And a rich mathematical task, you're going to see the ones that I have here are not especially challenging. Quite honestly, from the point at which I decided to do this, I was in some classrooms and gathered some work with students so that they were not especially complicated tasks, but they're the everyday tasks your students are doing at this point in the year. A rich mathematical task is a task given to students just above their current level. This comes from the work of Lev Vygotsky, the proximal zone of development, that we need our kids to struggle a little bit. If we give them work that is too easy for them, they're going to give you the answer. And when you ask why, they're going to go, because that's the answer. So you need something that they're going to struggle with a little bit. We're calling this the productive struggle, that they know the goal, they get there, and we want them working together because then you're going to increase their communication. We're also hearing about performance tasks. Performance tasks more often go across strands. They are deeper. Sadly, what they've kind of become is more the tasks you see on state tests and benchmark tests, which are read this task, which is fairly interesting, answer this question. Now that you've got the answer to that question, answer this question. Now that you've got that answer, so they build. Anchor tasks are another form of rich mathematical tasks. Anchor tasks are actually out of Japan, but they're also what they're using in Singapore. They are used to anchor to possibly previous lessons that they've had or to future learning. In rich mathematical tasks and anchor tasks, they are more constructivist. They're more of a constructivist approach. So students are building their understanding. Teachers have a very important role that after students have solved these problems, then they have to consolidate learning and bring the students together to make sure that everybody comes to a common understanding and where they want them to go. Anytime you have a question, please feel free to type it in your message box. I can't see it, but Faulkner can, and Faulkner will interrupt me at any point. I like to do the questioning as we go because it's much easier than trying to go back and forth. So please don't hesitate to ask questions anytime. When I'm lucky, my job is often to go into schools and I conduct lessons or I observe teachers conducting lessons. And I always say, remember, the person doing the talking is the one doing the learning. So if you're standing up there and you're doing all the talking, the children are not the ones doing the learning. And when I'm in the classroom, what I say most often is, back off. The kids find that very amusing. They like their teachers and their administrators being told to back off a little bit. But we're teachers, and we got into this to help students. We're dying to jump in and help them. But we need to give them that time to struggle and to think through it. I find it very interesting that once you develop this habit, you can listen to your whole room to tell exactly where they are. When you first give a task, very often it's silent. The kids are trying to read and digest and trying to gauge who in their group is going to do the work for them. And then you start getting interactions, you start getting them talking and thinking, and hopefully they're getting their manipulatives out and they're doing and exploring. And then all of a sudden the noise starts getting louder. That's when I find the students are done generally and that they're starting to go off task. That's the time for me to bring them back together. During this time, I'm walking around the classroom and I am looking at who has what kind of solutions. I have always picked out exactly what I want to see, so I jot notes about which groups of students have come up with which solution so that I can call them up to demonstrate to the other students so that the students are teaching each other because the one doing the talking is the one doing the learning. Lev Vygotsky also tells us that students actually learn better from each other than they do from us. And so I will have one student explain, I'll have another student revoice what that student has said, so I make sure my students are the one doing the talking. So I approach this, doing a webinar is always challenging for me because I really enjoy the interaction. So I approach this webinar a few different ways. And the first way I did it is I had this beautiful completed student work. And then I thought, well, you're not going to see any evidence of questioning. So I went back and I got very raw student work. Now, after I got it, I realized, well, now you're not going to see where questioning took us. But what I'm going to show you here is student work and the questions I asked them. The mistake I found I made, and some of them have a little better showing than others, is I didn't show what they did after I asked their questions. So a teacher told me that they were working on rounding and that they had done rounding a lot of different ways, most of them procedural. And could I help them with rounding? So I tried a few things with students to see where they were. I needed a little assessment. And then I decided to use place value strips. These come from Crystal Springs books. The reason you see 8:45 written on there is that students are also working on elapsed time. So I threw in there just to write down what time this lesson started, write down what time it ended, how much time did the lesson take. In Singapore, they call that making a guest appearance, things that you can just drop into a lesson. So this was the work of one group. And I said, well, what do these numbers represent? Now, where it has an asterisk with a number after it, that represents what mathematical practice they were asking about. So what do these numbers represent is the second mathematical practice, reason abstractly and quantitatively. So where did they get those numbers? When I did my math coaching tool, math practices coaching tool, I also put in some stems for how to get students started and where you could go if students were stuck. So these students were stuck. They built the number they were asked to round 8,237 to the nearest 10. This was a ways into the lesson. We found the kids had no trouble rounding to the thousands place, but if you asked them to round hundreds or 10, they struggled. So I asked these questions just to see where the students would go from here. I only ask questions when I'm working with students. It would be very unusual for me to give a hint. Now, then I decided that in my saying back off, that I needed to give levels of questioning. So, and if you've heard one of my webinars before, or if you've seen me before, you've heard this. I ask questions that, oops, that was not what I wanted to do. Nudge, push, or shove students. So a nudge question is a very general question, not really related to the task. So a nudge question might be, what manipulatives might help you? Faulkner, is that showing up as I'm writing?
Yes, it is.
Perfect.
And when you're done with this, too, we do have a couple of questions for you, Ricky.
It might be, where are you stuck? I'm working on a surface, and it's very temperamental. What's the question? So nudge questions are very general questions. Now, push questions are for kids who are in the ballpark and they just need a tiny little push. It might be, what places are going to stay the same, which are going to change. What do you remember about rounding? Shove questions are for kids who don't know there's a game going on, aren't even aware there's a ballpark. Bonhar talks about kids who are uh, at on the plane, those need a nudge, who are at the airport, they need a push, and who haven't even left home, those need a shove. Shove could be, uh, if we're rounding to 10, what decade are you in? So you would be finding you're between, I can't remember my numbers now, of course, 8,200 what and what? So that they are very directed questions. Okay, I'll stop and I'll take a minute for questions. So this is a great time to ask them if you've got any. And
Okay.
Faulkner, what have you got so far?
Our first one was someone was looking for an anchor task example, and I'm not sure if actually maybe you're going to be getting to that later on. It looks like it says DI uses this as the go back to tasks for early finishers, and this sounds different.
DI does use this differently. DI generally starts with an anchor task, and it's much more about connecting to prior learning. I always find it interesting when I look at something that DI or language arts is doing and how math does it differently, because I always like to be aware of those. An anchor task can be any place in a lesson. The anchor task that we were starting here, it was just playing with these and asking rounding questions. An anchor task could be something like, one of my favorite anchor tasks is I have a lot of coins in my purse. Faulkner needs exact change for $1. What amount of money might I have in my purse, and what coins would they be where I cannot make exact change for $1? So it's really hard because kids think instantly the answer is 99 cents. And I'd be happy to type this out if Faulkner reminds me. And I can put this in the Q&A that he sends out soon, so that you can look at them. I also have a full, I think it's 2 or 3 pages of sources for anchor tasks, performance tasks, and rich mathematical tasks that I've been working on, where I've been collecting who has them and where I found the best ones. And I've used, all of our math presenters have contributed to this list, and I've tried to source them out and say exactly what they're good for, what grades are good for, what areas, what strands, kind of highlights of them. So it's something I'm happy to share. So an anchor task might occur right at the beginning of the lesson, but not always. Sometimes it occurs in the middle of the lesson. Sometimes it's the end of the lesson. This one was used more toward the right before our guided practice. It was more at the beginning of our guided practice stage, because we needed to see how kids were doing. So it can be used anywhere, and you get terrific formative assessment knowledge.
Okay, in a follow-up along with that, Anne was just double-checking, was asking about DI. She's familiar with it as direct instruction, or is that what it is, or something else?
DI stands for 2 different things, interestingly enough. In my district, it's direct instruction. It's also differentiated instruction. So in direct instruction, the anchor task can be at any point in the lesson. In differentiated instruction, an anchor task is at the beginning of a lesson. So, yeah, it's interesting. Different places have different, DI means 2 different things.
Okay, and one other question before we move along. Megan was saying, my district uses Go Math as the Common Core aligned curriculum. They've been challenged to focus for 3 weeks on each math practical skill. How should the 8 practice standards support curriculum and vice versa?
The 8 mathematical practices, and it doesn't matter what your curriculum is, um, must be infused in every lesson you teach. When we look at the highly successful countries, we see that their instruction is focused on problem solving. And that's what these 8 practices are all about. It's this huge paradigm shift of let's focus on the problem solving and then teach the computation skills that get us there instead of what we used to do, which was an entire page of long division problems, and then at the bottom there were 2-word problems, and surprise, surprise, they were long division. Now, if we focus on what our students need to solve problems, and then they're going to develop the skills. Common Core has gotten some bad press, and I think it has to do a lot with teachers who haven't gotten the training they need and parents who are spending too much time on social media. Because 85% of the time children will get to a traditional algorithm. It is what's most efficient, and long division is questionable. They will get there eventually, but we want them to get there with understanding, because we know when students understand what they're doing, they're going to have better mastery and better retention. Did that answer that question?
I believe so.
Okay. Other questions?
I think we're good for a little bit.
Okay. We're going to stay on this rounding task we did, I hope. Here's another student's work, and you can see this anchor task was very simple. I did not write out this huge problem. There was a context to it, but I did not, I didn't spend hours awake at night coming up with this very creative thing. It was, I believe the problem was I have $8,237 and I only have $10 bills. What amount am I going to give the shopkeeper or the bank was going to give me? I can't remember exactly what it was, but I do put it in context when I present it to the children, because when we put numbers in context, they do have greater meaning. So this child drew a number line first. So they've got 8,230, 31, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. And then, so first they drew their number line. And I said, how does your number line help you? Which was, they were using an appropriate tool. And then I said, can you explain your number line in words? Which was math practice number 3, construct visible arguments. So then they went back and they wrote out in words, 8,240 to the nearest 10 because 8,235 is in the middle, and 7 is more than 5, so it goes to the next 10. So here's a place where you do see an example of the questions went here, and then the student expanded their work. Clearly, this was not very challenging to this group of students. Here is a student, and you see method 1, method 2, method 3. So that this was a student who this was very simple for. And so first with method 1, I said, well, they called them number slips. They're actually called place value strips. How did the number slips help? What other manipulatives might help? So first I asked them about using appropriate tools strategically. And then I said, okay, but you built the number, but I don't see an answer. So did they help you? Then they came back and they did a number line. So I asked them, well, how did the number line help you? Was one method more efficient? So the number line, if you see they've got 8,200, 8,240, 8,250, that also was not very appropriate. And I said, well, what was the relationship between the slips and the number line? Was one method more efficient than the other? But I didn't see 8,237 on the number line. And I still don't see an answer. So then they went to method 3, and I said, well, how's this answer related to the other methods? What new words did you learn today? Because when they gave oral answers, they gave very precise answers. How did you use them? So this group came up with 3 methods, although they never truly showed their work. If I was scoring this on a rubric, it would actually get quite a low score because I don't ever really see their thinking. So this one was kind of interesting because they have the right answer, but I don't see too much thinking out of them. All right, here is another student. Any questions first before I move on?
Let me just check here. We do have a couple. And first off, actually, just a housekeeping one. Just a reminder to everybody that actually the archive of the webinar will be available in 48 hours after the event. So if there are some things that you are wanting to see again, you'll be able to do that in about 48 hours. But a question for you, Michael was wondering, do you have specific questions that you ask that go with each of the mathematical practices?
I used to just ask, how do you know? Are you sure? Tell me more. And I found that that was really not quite enough. So I spent quite a bit of time developing questions, and I think just this last week, I was out of town this last week, someplace with no internet, no email, no phone. And when I got home, I have written I don't know what you call it, a booklet kind of thing called the Math Practices Coaching Tool. And there are questions that go, specific questions that go with each of the 8 mathematical practices. And then there's an extra page of how to get students started, how to help students who are stuck, and then extension questions. So it is available for Crystal Springs Books. And that's where that's something I've been working on for a few months, because how do you know and tell me more was really not cutting it anymore. I needed something that was a little deeper, so I wrote something. Anything else?
This is actually,
Faulkner?
yep, sorry, I muted myself
Okay.
there. One question, do you have suggestions for how to get the students and the parents to understand the vocabulary of the Common Core?
Yes, parent nights. I think at this time of Common Core, parent nights are critical. Vocabulary is very interesting because I was fortunate enough to go to Singapore a year ago, and a year and a half ago, I guess, and they do not stress vocabulary in Singapore. They believe that you don't introduce vocabulary until after children have mastered the curriculum, mastered that concept, because when children start using the correct vocabulary, it makes it sound like they know more than they do. However, that doesn't quite apply here because their children don't have the testing demands that we have. So what I do is I think journals are critical, and that we keep journals where students keep logs of their vocabulary, maybe have a vocabulary section in back. I think that it is critical that you have a math vocabulary word wall classroom, and math vocabulary, your math word wall is very different than your language arts word wall. Your language arts word wall is there to support sight, reading, and spelling. Your math word wall needs to have the word, it needs to have some kind of model or representation, and it needs to have a definition in the student's own language. If you have students copy the the vocabulary out of a glossary, it is meaningless. And I think that parents start to understand that. One activity that I love to do with students, and you could do it equally well at a parent night, is children could either do it with their parents, parents could do it with another parent, children can do it with children, is have them build a creature with tangrams or pattern blocks, or they could even draw it. And then they have to describe it to their partner who cannot see what they have drawn. And the person describing it cannot look at the person who's drawing it. And then they see how important that precise vocabulary is, the positional words, the prepositions, and how the more precise you are, the better their representation is, so that we can start to see how important our vocabulary is. Sadly, it's also important because it's such a huge part of our testing is our vocabulary. Did I answer that?
I believe so. And
okay,
mm-hmm.
Go ahead. I hate not being able to get a response from the person who asked. So I've got Faulkner.
And we had a bunch of people asking about the link to your book. So I just chatted that out. So that should be in the chat box on your screen. The link to Ricky's new book on Crystal Springs Books.
And when I say new, I got it last night.
I just checked to make sure that it was actually online because I was worried it wasn't.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I got it yesterday.
It was that new.
Yeah, it's that
actually,
new.
I think we're good. We're caught up now on the questions, so I would go ahead.
Okay, so here's another student, and this one was very simple. What tools did you use? Now, this student was also quite advanced. What tools did you use? How does rounding change? So I needed some extension questions. How does rounding change if the numbers are larger or smaller? Keep in mind that we're rounding to the nearest 10. What patterns did you see when you used the place value strips? How can you tell if your answer is reasonable? So your questions need to not only fit the task and fit the student work, they need to fit the student's abilities. This one was very interesting because these students whipped this out very quickly. We first looked at the ones place. If it was above 5, it goes to the nearest 10. 8,237 has a 7 in the ones place, so we have to change the tens place and the ones place. If you had 3, you will get your answer. Well, that's very interesting, but then look at what they've written, 8,237 plus 3, which really has nothing to do with it. So my questions had to address, it's not a misconception, but there is something in there. Have you compared your work to anyone else's? How is it alike and different? When I talk about a student who is struggling or misbehaving, it's either Chester or Chesterina, because there are very few children named that these days. Could you draw a model or a representation to help Chester understand what you've written? Because I think if they had drawn a model, that might have helped them see what the problem with theirs was. Then I got a little more direct. I see you added 3. Can you explain how that relates? Can you give an example of where that doesn't work? Because if it had ended in an 8, adding 3 wouldn't work. So I wanted them to see where they got their right answer, but their explanation didn't really match. It didn't make sense, but their answer was correct. Moving to a different problem, these students were told that I had 32 of something. Maybe there were 32 kids in a class, and there were 5 classes. How much was that in all? And so I found this very interesting. This was a class that, in theory, had never done 2-digit times 1-digit multiplication. However, Some students in there had gone to some tutoring where they had learned it someplace else. So the student got the right answer very quickly, and I said, show me another way. So he went 8 times 4 is 32 times 4 plus 32. So they found a way to get to the right answer. So I needed to add some questioning to that. So the first one I did was, could you add labels to all your numbers? That's practice number 2, which is reason abstractly and quantitatively. Putting our numbers to words, putting our words to numbers. Could you tell me a story to go with those numbers? Could you defend your procedure? Because his first one worked, but that second one was odd. Then, can you tell your partner your step in words? I was trying to get them to see that doing 8 times 4 happened to be 32, but it really made no sense. 8 and 4 had no part in the story. And then why did you choose to multiply by 4 first? Well, really they were decomposing 5, but decomposing 5 into 4 and 1 made very little sense. If they had multiplied 32 times 10 and cut it in half, that would have made a lot more sense. So part of this questioning is to make students see that this is a student who was so procedural, he could absolutely get those numbers and get those numbers to the correct answer, but not in a way that showed number sense, that showed deep number sense. He could just show it procedurally. Here's another student who is pretty good at procedures, but has some issues. The teacher asked them to multiply 4 2/10 divided by 7/10. So this student wrote, they had to write a word problem to go with it. This is a kind of anchor test that shows such interesting thinking. Do they understand a concept or are they misconceptions? Larry is 4 2/10 feet. His brother is 1/7 of that. How tall is Larry's brother? So it shouldn't have been divided by 7. It should have been divided by 7/10. So they got an answer, and I can see a procedure and look at how they know to move the decimal. Can you work with Chestarina? So now I'm going to have them go work with another group to decide if one answer is correct or if you're both correct. The answer next to them was different. What units of measurement are used in your story? Could you add labels? Could you find your story in real life? Would it be real life that your brother is 6/10 of anything tall? And then what do you need to know about 7/10? So I went back to showing understanding here, because this was a student who didn't really make sense of the problem before they started, but they were very fast in solving it. Any more questions before I go on?
I've got a couple here for you. First off, Megan was wondering, she said she'd love to know some strategies you use in whole classwork, not just in one-on-one conferences or in a student presentation at the board with the teacher questioning. Are there any tricks you can share to push students' thinking when one teacher is working with lots of students in a typical classroom?
If you have your students work in groups of 4, now you're going to take your 24 students, say, is what we see a lot. Now you only have 6 groups to check in on. And I can check in on 6 students. I cannot check in on 24 students. Even if I have 32, which was the number I most commonly had in my class, I could check in on 8 groups of students. In Singapore, in grades 3 through 5, they have 40 students per class. They can check in on groups of 4. And so having them work together. Another thing I do that was very helpful was that when my students are working in groups, very often I have them count off from 1 to 4 or 1 to 3, whatever group size I have, and then I roll a die, and that tells which student is going to be responsible for explaining their group's work to the class. Sometimes they always count off in the beginning. Sometimes I roll the dice, sometimes I don't. But that way they know that it's not about that top student in the group getting the answer, which they all neatly copy. They all have to understand it. And it takes time at the beginning of the year to build that culture. And it's helpful if you are at a school where that is a school-wide value. And really that's what the Common Core is about, is our students building understanding. So that if our students are doing that, this comes more easily. Even if the other thing I do whole class is these questions are great journal prompts. And so that if I don't have time to ask, to do groups, if I'm doing something whole class, it could be, as a matter of fact, this problem that's showing up now was their journal prompt. It was not a task, so it was individual work. So the students would do this in their journal. When I did journals in my class, and I taught at a time when we still had 32 students, I divided my class into 4 groups. They each had a color, and Monday through Thursday I would collect one color journal, and so Monday through Thursday I had to look at those journals, and I had a system. I always found, I'll call them efficient ways to deal with this. Of the journals I looked at, there should have been 4 or 5 entries. One of them would get a real comment that I would look at thoroughly. One of them would get, like a good or a great or, needs more. One of them would get a sticker, one would get a stamp. So that really I'm only deeply looking at one of the journal of 8 students. And I could do that every day. That did not take very long. So that group was responsible for turning them into me. And that was how I dealt with whole class things. Anything else?
Let me see here. Did have a question from Barb asking if are your groups heterogeneous groups, or do you have students grouped together based on similar abilities? Oh, Ricky, I think you might have muted yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Okay, I lean forward on my mute button. Sorry. I did heterogeneous groups because the groups need to support each other. However, I did not put my very highest kids usually with my very lowest kids, because I found they often did not have the patience to deal with them. Now, it's kind of a generalization. What I did was I usually put my highest kids more with my middle kids, and I made sure my lowest kids had the child in the class who could have taken over for you as teacher if you were ever absent. We all know we have one of those in our class who's got teacher stamped on their forehead from the minute they're born. I made sure they were with my lowest kids. And we talked a lot about the culture, that we all make mistakes and that that's acceptable, and we give each other wait time, and they can laugh at me if I make a mistake, but we don't laugh at each other because that hurts feelings. And we really stress that a lot. Anything else?
Let me see. Sorry, as soon as someone asks a question, it slides all the other questions out of the way. Megan had a follow-up question, and just saying, so journal entries are meant to only inform instruction. There's no grades for journals?
There were sometimes. I never say never, and I never say always. If there was going to be a grade to a journal entry, I would always let the students know that before. This one's really important. But for me, my journals were much more about formative assessment and informing my instruction than they were about grades. But it was known to happen that I would take a grade on a journal entry. I also, when I had workstations, there was always an accountability component. It might be a journal. There was always something to turn in because I didn't always trust the little darlings to do what they said they were doing there. So I always had a piece there. All right, anything else? Faulkner?
Oh, sorry, I muted myself again too. One last question from Carrie here. Do you use wait time, and if so, how long for response for verbal responses, or do you prefer written in the journal format to be able to show progress?
I have the best wait time of anybody in the world. I learned that I am a very fast thinker. I, however, am not an accurate thinker, and I went with a coworker to a workshop, and she is a very slow, deliberate thinker, which drove me a little crazy. However, she was correct a huge percentage more than I was, and that was such an important lesson. So there are several things I do. I'm a huge believer in wait time. I tell the students that often I will ask a question, and either I pull a stick or I have a random name generator come off of a smart board or active board, or I had the names on poker chips in a jar because if I shook them they were very loud. If I ask a question, if I pull a name and that person doesn't know, nobody can help them until they say help. That they deserve all that think time. Another thing I talk about a lot, and this really goes with my last comment, not this one, was that the new research shows that every time you make a mistake, you are growing a new synapse. And so when I was working with a group, I think their pictures are coming up soon, every time they would make a mistake, the kids would say, "Your brain is growing," and I made a mistake, and the kids just laughing. "Oh, my skull's going to have to grow to accommodate it." That they have to have wait time. You have kids who are perfectionists, who are afraid to say an answer until they've thought through all the consequences and all the other possibilities. So we've got to give our kids wait time, and it's painful. We're in such a hurry. Our math period is short, and our year is short, and testing's, I feel even at this time of the year, testing's coming any minute. But we need to have that wait time because it's so important. Okay, Faulkner, how much more time do I have to talk?
Well, because we've been going through questions, I figure probably let's keep going for another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll pause to do our housekeeping stuff, and then get back to some more questions after that.
Okay, so this was kind of interesting. This was how many ways can you find the difference between 62 and 35? And this was fascinating. A student told me 62 was 30, 20, 30 plus 20 plus 5 plus 5 plus 2, and 35 was 30 plus 5. And then they crossed out what they had in common. So first I had to say, well, is your answer reasonable? What math vocabulary was important to you? This is as the student was processing in front of the class, because that word difference was so key that some kids had not even seen that this was subtraction. Could you explain to the class how you chose to decompose 62? Why wasn't it 30 plus 30? Why wasn't it 60 plus 2? And they said they knew they needed a 5 there. Sorry, wrong way. Can you explain a pattern you see? Is this related to the traditional algorithm? How? Well, the answer the answer was no, it's not related to the traditional algorithm. So I thought this was such an interesting piece of thinking and sparked such interesting discussion. But then the next discussion was, is this an efficient way to solve this? Because it was not especially efficient, but the kids really thought it was fun and it was a good game and it did show number sense. Here are some, I want to say fourth graders. So here they are, they're solving a problem with money. It's a division problem and they're working in their groups. And the problem was $5.65 divided by 4, I believe. So here they came up with their answer. The answer was $1.13. Then they had to show a picture of it. Well, their picture was $1, a dime, and 3 pennies. Then another way to solve, they did it with number bonds. They broke $5 into $4 and $1.65, which was brilliant. Then they broke it into $1.65, and then they started doing some other stuff. So my questioning, how could you record your manipulative work? So they'd done this fabulous work with manipulatives. They had shown an answer, but they had not, when I said record your work, they had only recorded the answer. They had not recorded what they did. What thinking is shown in method 2? Well, no thinking was shown in method 2. How did you decompose $1.65? Very oddly, because they could have done $1.60 divided by 4, but they did some other things. How would you use what you did today if you saw another problem like this? So that got to be very interesting, was how are you going to apply this? And that was their extension question. Okay, the last one I'm going to show are some third graders, and they are subtracting $3.75 from $8.15. And I said, you have to show it more than one way. They ran out of whiteboard. They needed 2. So they showed traditional, they showed open number line, and then they showed a number bond, and then they showed some other things. So for this one, my idea was, but I don't think we have time for it, I wanted you to write the questions. But fortunately, you are saved because Faulkner is going to take over from here, and he's going to talk, and then we'll answer questions.
Thanks, Ricky. And as I said, we since we've been getting to a number of the questions as we go, this is kind of a shortened version of the end of the webinar. I hope everybody's enjoyed everything so far. I'm just going to take a minute or two to let everybody submit any last questions via that window on their screen, because again, whether Ricky answers them today or not, she'll actually get all the questions and we'll send them back with written responses that we can post along with the archive on the SDE site. And just a few things. As a special thank you for attending today's webinar, we would like to offer you a 10% discount off SDE professional development resources, events, and on-site training by using the promo code W092215 before October 22nd, 2015. You might be interested in saving 10% and joining Ricky at her 2-day seminar, Making Math Meaningful. She's going to be in Arizona, New Hampshire, Louisiana, Tennessee, and New York State, with dates ranging from November through February of next year. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, keep in mind that you can bring Ricky on site to your school or district for customized training or classroom modeling. For more information about PD events, training, or resources, give us a call at 877-388-2054 or visit us at sde.com. Please also look for us on online. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest with the username SDE4Educators. So it's SDE, the number 4, and educators. And Ricky can be found, she is at RMMath on Twitter and at pinterest.com/Ricky_Mikelman. And just a reminder that live attendees of the webinar will receive a follow-up email in 48 hours that will include a link to a printable certificate of participation for this webinar, as well as a link to the archived recording as well. I've got a few people asking about the code for that. The code is W092215. So today's date with a W in front of it.
Which is today's date. It's a mystery how Faulkner comes up with this.
Well, it's a mystery when I get it wrong.
Yeah.
So everybody, thanks for waiting, and let's get to the last questions that we can until it's time to end. Ricky, let me see. And actually, I've been asked to post the code in the window, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. That's in the chat window there. And let me see. Mary was asking. I'm sorry. Karen was asking, how did you learn to ask questions? Was it trial and error, or how do you acquire that skill?
It was. I've been very fortunate in my career that I've had a lot of variety. That I've taught all the grades, and seeing where kids start and where they go has been very helpful. That I was a math coach for 3 years in Los Angeles and 3 years in Texas, and then going to Singapore a year and a half ago really opened my eyes. So and then when the Common Core came in with these 8 practices, I realized that I always stuck to certain areas. I wasn't very good at looking for the patterns in things, and I wasn't good at making use of structure and repeated reasoning. I was really strong in making sense of problems and persevering and constructing arguments and modeling. But then I decided to start writing them down and researching and thinking, and what made me write them down was because way back in the olden days I had taken a workshop on cognitively guided instruction, and I had questions on a ring back in those days. And I went to all my friends that had gone to that training to see if anybody had those left, and nobody had them, so I decided that I would try and recreate that. But then it's this habit of every time you start to jump in and help a student, take a step back, take a breath, watch them for a minute. Are they in a state of productive struggle where they're continuing to work, or has it become destructive struggle? Are they frustrated? Are they mad? Have they lost sight? And you've got to, you need to ask a question before they get to destructive struggle, so they're continuing to make forward process. So it's a lot of practice, but mostly it's stepping back and taking a breath. So I tried to do the legwork for you on asking the questions.
And actually, this question from Barb kind of ties in with that, and she was asking, how do you encourage students by asking them questions?
It's when I go into classrooms, kids know they're going to be challenged, and they think it's fun. They're doing math, but they think it's fun, and they're encouraged. I don't have to do anything to encourage them. I give them math that is meaningful to them and is fun to them, and they don't mind it at all. They mind a sheet of 50 multiplication problems, and I mind that too, because if I can do the left column, why do I have to do all 50? And if I can't do the left column, do I want to practice it wrong 50 times? So when we make math more interesting, our kids need less encouragement. The other thing I do with my struggling learners is, instead of my tutorials, I tend to pre-teach instead of reteach, because that way they're in the game. They know what's going on. They've kind of seen it. They have some sense of it. So it's not like it's being taught in a foreign language. And what I didn't do here that is very different from this workshop I'm going to be doing all over the country is I didn't give you anchor tasks. Faulkner, what's the date in October where we're going to be doing more of an anchor task webinar or rich mathematical task webinar?
I want to say it is October 15th. Let me just
I
double check
want to
that.
say you're right. Yeah. Uh, but that's coming up, so that will give you another taste of what's happening in this workshop. If you're able to join me, it should be interesting. Yes, October 15th.
Yep.
That
Yep.
This one was just about the questions. That one will be a little bit different. So.
And that was the question Susan was asking, what was the name of the workshop that you were giving, and that is Making Math Meaningful.
Yes.
And that's the one that's going to be November through February. Ricky, coming to your town soon.
Or not coming to your town, but, come join me, because it's not my town
Coming to a state
either.
nearby.
Yeah. coming to your region of the country.
I'm going to give you one more question, and then I think we probably need to call it a day. Lori was asking, you mentioned that having a vocabulary log or journal is a good idea, but not having them copy definitions out of a glossary. She was wondering what other ways can students record definitions?
If you have some kind of smartboard or active board, you can do it as a group and then hit the print screen button, and then you've made your word wall right there. I used to have my students do them on 5x7 cards, and then I would hole punch the top left corner of them and put them in a ring, and then students could alphabetize them. They could sort them by strand. That was a huge one. The students really liked that one. And that way they could also put computation techniques on there, so that was kind of a little cheat system that they could always go back and look at that. Sometimes, especially with third graders or early in the year, we had to do them together until they really got the hang of it, or we would brainstorm a lot of the ideas on the board, and the kids would have to take all those ideas and put them into their definition. So there was there was a number of different ways we did it.
All right.
But it is so important.
And I will say it's actually we've gone past 5 o'clock now, so I should shut it down, respect everybody's time. I do want to thank everybody for joining us, and if we didn't get to your question, like I said, I'll be sending these to Ricky to answer, and we'll post those the entire Q&A along with the webinar archive on sd.com. And when we have that up there, we'll let you know on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. And I want to thank Ricky for joining us today, and I hope everybody enjoyed today's presentation, and the rest of everybody's day is outstanding. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.